Imagine yourself standing on the edge of the frontier in the mid-1800s. Before you lies not a paved highway, not a steel railway, but an endless sea of wilderness stretching from the Missouri River to the valleys of Oregon. Over 2,000 miles of hostile terrain. There are no rest stops, no hospitals, no safety nets. Just you, your wagon, your family, and a dream of something better waiting beyond the horizon. But here is the cruel truth. If you were dropped onto the Oregon Trail for even a single day, the odds of survival would be stacked brutally against you. This was not the heroic adventure of storybooks. It was an unforgiving gauntlet of hunger, disease, violence, and despair. Before we unravel these horrors, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Comment below, because I want to know who's traveling this trail with us. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe, because this journey into the darker side of history is just beginning. Now, let's take our first steps onto the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail promised settlers new beginnings, free land, fertile soil, the hope of independence. But that promise was wrapped in lies. The journey itself was a test that most would fail. For every wagon that rolled into the Willamette Valley, countless others broke apart long before the end. And the trail began not with glory, but with exhaustion. Think about the simple act of leaving your home. You sold most of your possessions, stripped your life down to essentials. Every pound of weight mattered, and so families agonized over what to take. A piano? Too heavy? A cast iron stove? Leave it behind. Sometimes even treasured heirlooms were abandoned along the roadside as wagons groaned under the burden. By the time you set out, your world was reduced to a rattling wooden box on wheels. Inside, sacks of flour, barrels of bacon, maybe a crate of tools, and if you were lucky, a Bible. Everything else had to be sacrificed. And from the very first mile, the trail reminded you this was no place for weakness. One of the first enemies you would meet on the trail was hunger. Guides and handbooks told emigrants to bring 200 pounds of flour per adult, 50 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 of sugar. On paper, it looked like abundance. In reality, it was never enough. Rations had to be measured carefully. Each day, a family might grind out coarse biscuits from flour infested with weevils. Bacon, salted to last the journey, grew rancid in the summer sun. Coffee ran out within months, and sugar often vanished before the halfway mark. So what did people do when food failed? They improvised. Some boiled leather belts and boots to soften them into something chewable. Others scraped moss from rocks or dug for wild roots. Children were sent scurrying after grasshoppers, which could be roasted and eaten when starvation pressed too close. Now imagine yourself trying to choke down a strip of greenish, maggot-ridden bacon, because it was the only thing standing between you and collapse. That was the reality of the trail, and you wouldn't last a day without feeling its bite. But hunger was only half the problem. Water was the real killer. The trail followed rivers for much of its length, the Platte, the Sweetwater, the Snake, but they were deceptive lifelines. The Platte, in particular, was notorious. One immigrant wrote that it was too thick to drink, too thin to plow. It stank, choked with silt and animal carcasses. Settlers dipped their buckets into the same water where oxen bathed, where cholera seeped from the bodies of the dead. A single sip could spell your end. Cholera outbreaks tore through wagon trains with terrifying speed. One moment, a man would be walking beside his oxen. Hours later, he'd be doubled over in agony, his body racked by cramps and vomiting. Within a day, he'd be buried in a shallow grave beside the trail, marked only by a wooden cross or a pile of stones. Between 1849 and 1869, thousands of immigrants died this way. The Oregon Trail was less a road to freedom than a graveyard that stretched for 2,000 miles. And thirst was one of its cruelest executioners. Cholera wasn't alone. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, each disease lurked in the filth of camp life. With hundreds of wagons moving west in great caravans, disease spread like wildfire. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Latrines were shallow pits, often dug too close to camp. Flies moved freely between waste and food. If you think modern camping is uncomfortable, try sleeping under the stench of your own survival. Children were especially vulnerable. Diarrhea and fever could strip the life from a child in days. And there was no doctor waiting at the next outpost. Medicine, if it existed at all, came in the form of dubious patent remedies, bottles of laudanum laced with opium, or tonics spiked with alcohol. They dulled pain, but they didn't heal. For many, the Oregon Trail was not a journey of discovery. It was a march into sickness. The land itself seemed determined to kill you. Early in the journey, endless prairies stretched in all directions. Without shade, the sun beat down mercilessly. By afternoon, temperatures soared, lips cracked, and children fainted from heat stroke. Then came the mountains. Wagons groaned up steep inclines, oxen strained until blood streamed from their noses. Wheels snapped, axles broke, wagons tipped into ravines. Families sometimes stood helpless as their entire livelihoods crashed into pieces below. And when the mountains didn't claim lives, the weather tried. Storms swept across the plains without warning, lightning striking wagons, wind ripping canvas covers to shreds. In winter, blizzards froze travelers where they stood. The land made no promises. It offered no mercy. As if disease and starvation weren't enough, violence shadowed every wagon. Sometimes it came from fellow immigrants. Tempers ran hot in the endless monotony. Arguments over food, grazing rights, or broken agreements often ended in blood. Other times, fear turned outward. Many settlers believed attacks from native tribes were a constant threat. In truth, most encounters were peaceful or involved trade. But paranoia fueled violence. Settlers shot first, asking questions later. Skirmishes left wounds that echoed for generations. But whether the bullet came from within your own party or from a shadow on the ridge, it didn't matter. On the Oregon Trail, a moment of violence could end your story forever. Perhaps the cruelest burden of all was psychological. Imagine trudging day after day beside the wagon, walking 15 miles, your feet blistered and bleeding. Imagine burying your child by the roadside, then forcing yourself to march on, because stopping meant death for everyone else. The Oregon Trail was not just a test of the body, but of the soul. Many immigrants broke under the strain. Diaries tell of mothers weeping silently through the night, fathers crushed by guilt, children growing silent and hollow-eyed. The road west was paved with suffering, and the truth is, if you were thrown into that world today, even for 24 hours, the shock would destroy you. So now ask yourself, would you really survive even a single day on the Oregon Trail? Or would the hunger, the thirst, the sickness, the grief swallow you whole? And if you want to uncover the rest of this story, the darker, more twisted truths of survival on the trail, make sure you're subscribed, because this is only part 1. In the next chapter, we'll dig even deeper into the nightmare. The broken bodies of oxen, the poisoned rivers, and the desperate decisions that forced families to cross the line between human and animal. The first day on the Oregon Trail was brutal enough, but as the miles dragged on, the nightmare only deepened. This wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Every mile stripped away a little more of your body, your spirit, your family, and your hope. At the heart of every wagon was not its passengers, but its animals. Oxen, mules, and sometimes horses bore the weight of survival. Without them, families were stranded dead men walking in a land that had no pity. But the truth is, most immigrants treated their animals as expendable tools. Oxen were whipped until their hides split. Mules collapsed under loads they were never meant to carry. Wagons demanded everything, and animals often gave their lives before the journey was through. Travelers rode of roads littered with carcasses. The stench of rotting flesh hung heavy in the summer air. Wolves and vultures circled constantly, feasting on the trail of death left by human ambition. If your oxen died, your journey ended. Some families abandoned wagons, leaving behind everything they owned. Others tried to carry on, dragging sledges by hand. Children roped to carts like beasts themselves. And you? If you were dropped onto that trail, untrained, untested, unprepared, you wouldn't last a single morning, trying to coax a starving ox through mud, or drag your belongings up a mountain slope. Crossing rivers was one of the deadliest trials on the trail. Bridges didn't exist. Ferries were rare and often costly, which meant families had to ford rivers themselves, rolling wagons into rushing waters and praying to survive. Many didn't. Wagons tipped, goods scattered, oxen drowned, and children were swept away in the current. Survivors staggered to shore, soaked, shivering, watching their dreams vanish downstream. The rivers themselves carried death, even when they didn't claim lives directly. Contaminated water spread disease faster than anything else. Entire wagon trains fell ill after drinking from streams already fouled by other emigrants or the bodies of animals rotting upstream. The trail was not just a road of dirt. It was a road of water, of mud, of drowning and despair. And each river crossing was a gamble with death. If you survived hunger, thirst, and disease, there was still another killer waiting. Sheer accident. Wagons were not forgiving machines. They were crude, heavy, and merciless. Wheels crushed limbs. Axles splintered into jagged shards. Rifles went off while being loaded. Children were run over in camp. Something as simple as falling beneath a wheel could end your life instantly. A broken leg meant death, unless your family was willing to drag your crippled body for thousands of miles. Even campfires turned deadly. Long skirts caught flame easily, and many women burned alive as their families tried helplessly to smother the fire. One day, that's all it would take for you to realize how fragile survival was. Not an enemy, not even disease, just a moment's bad luck. Walking 15 to 20 miles a day broke even the strongest emigrants. Wagons were too precious for adults to ride. Most had to trudge through dust and mud, mile after mile, day after day. Feet blistered and bled. Boots disintegrated. Children collapsed from exhaustion. Some were tied to wagons to keep them from falling behind, dragged half-conscious through the dirt. And still, the march never stopped. Every delay risked disaster. The trail had a season, and if you fell behind, winter would close its fist around you. Imagine walking barefoot over sharp rocks, your belly empty, your throat raw with thirst, the sun beating down like a hammer. Now imagine doing it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next for half a year. That was the Oregon Trail, but perhaps the cruelest trial wasn't physical. It was mental. Imagine burying your child by the roadside and walking away because you had no choice. Imagine carrying the guilt of watching your wife waste away from fever while you could do nothing but feed her laudanum and hope. The Oregon Trail shattered families long before it killed them. Mothers and fathers turned on each other in blame. Neighbors abandoned one another in desperation. Even faith cracked under the endless strain. Some emigrants confessed in diaries that they wished for death. Others admitted they had become numb, immune to the endless parade of graves and suffering. Would you survive that? Not just the hunger, not just the thirst, but the slow erosion of your will to keep walking? Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 10 travelers died along the trail. That means every step was haunted by the dead. Graves lined the roadside shallow, hastily dug, often disturbed by animals. Sometimes, wagons rolled over the very graves of those who had died hours before. Travelers joked bitterly that the trail was the longest graveyard in America. But the reality was not a joke. It was trauma. Imagine walking with your children past a body hastily wrapped in a blanket, knowing tomorrow it might be you. Imagine marking your own family's grave with a crude wooden sign, and stepping back onto the road. The Oregon Trail was not a road to life. It was a conveyor belt to death, and survival was nothing short of miraculous. And yet, they kept walking. Why? Because the dream of Oregon was powerful. Guides promised rich farmland, fresh rivers, endless forests. Land free for the taking was a temptation strong enough to drive families through hell itself. But when many finally arrived, the reality was bitter. Land was harder to claim than promised. Farming was brutal work, often on soil that betrayed them. And the scars of the trail never faded. Survivors carried trauma for life. The promised land was not the paradise it had been sold as. For some, it was just another disappointment at the end of a road paved with death. The Oregon Trail wasn't a romantic adventure. It was a gauntlet. Hunger, thirst, disease, accidents, madness, death. If you think you could survive even one day of it, you're wrong. History itself proves it. Thousands tried and thousands failed. And yet, they walked anyway. The trail had already demanded too much lives, hope, humanity. But as the miles grew fewer, the dangers only grew greater. The final stretch was not a relief. It was a last gauntlet, a final chance for the trail to break you. For months, the trail lulled emigrants with flat plains and rolling hills. But eventually, the mountains loomed towering, jagged, merciless. The Blue Mountains in present-day Oregon were dreaded even more than the Rockies. Steep slopes tore apart wagons. Narrow passes trapped families in bottlenecks. Forests choked the path with fallen trees. Families already starving and sick found themselves climbing through thin air, dragging wagons up inclines so steep that oxen collapsed from exhaustion. Wheels shattered against rocks. Axles splintered. And if a wagon toppled, everything inside, food, tools, children, was lost in an instant. Night in the mountains was worse. Bitter cold cut through thin blankets. Fires sputtered in damp air. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. It was here, so close to the end, that many families finally broke. If you left too late in spring, you didn't make it before the snow. And snow in the mountains wasn't just inconvenient, it was lethal. Heavy drifts buried wagons. Frozen rivers became impassable. Food vanished. Families who had made it 2,000 miles could find themselves trapped within sight of the Willamette Valley, only to starve and freeze before reaching it. The Donner Party is the most infamous example, not on the Oregon Trail itself, but on a similar western route. Trapped by snow, starving, families turned to cannibalism. Parents ate their children. Children ate their parents. On the Oregon Trail, this was every traveler's nightmare. Survivors wrote of racing through mountain passes in October, praying with every step that snow would not fall before they were through. Would you survive that? Walking with frozen feet, your stomach gnawing itself hollow, while winter closed around you like a tomb? The Oregon Trail wasn't just nature against man. Sometimes it was man against man. Tensions within wagon trains often boiled over. Men killed each other in drunken fights. Families split apart over disputes about rations or leadership. Justice was swift and merciless. Accused thieves were hanged without trial, their bodies left swinging as warnings to others. And then there were clashes with indigenous peoples. Despite the myths, most native tribes did not constantly attack immigrants. In fact, many helped, offering food, trading goods, and guiding travelers. But when desperation drove immigrants to steal, when diseases carried by wagons devastated native communities, violence erupted. Wagon trains recorded ambushes, raids, and massacres. But far more often, it was immigrants who brought destruction, trampling sacred land, killing game, and spreading disease. The trail was not just a test of survival. It was a theater of conflict, where every human encounter could mean life or death. Perhaps the cruelest truth of the Oregon Trail was how it consumed the young. Children made up nearly half the emigrants, and they paid the heaviest price. They were worked to exhaustion, forced to fetch water, gather firewood, and walk endlessly. Disease struck them hardest. Measles, cholera, dysentery all tore through children like wildfire. Many were buried in shallow graves, their names carved onto wooden markers that vanished within a season. Imagine watching your child cough blood, too weak to walk, knowing there was no medicine, no help, no chance. Imagine lowering their body into the dirt, then being forced to walk on, leaving them behind forever. This was not rare. It was routine. Thousands of parents lived this nightmare. Thousands of children died nameless, forgotten, their only legacy a story of pain. At the start, wagons were heavy with supplies, flour, bacon, beans, cornmeal. But by the end, supplies were gone. Meals dwindled into scraps. A few spoonfuls of flour stirred into dirty water, or strips of leather boiled into weak soup. Families slaughtered their oxen, eating the very animals meant to carry them. Some diaries speak of men chewing on grass, roots, even candle wax to stave off hunger. Others describe children collapsing mid-step, unable to go on without food. Starvation didn't just weaken the body, it broke the mind. Parents stole from their neighbors. Friends turned on each other. Starving families fought over scraps of grain. By the time many reached Oregon, they were skeletal, hollow-eyed shadows of themselves. Survival had stripped away everything but bone and desperation. And yet, at the very end of this road of misery, lay the cruelest twist of all. The Oregon Trail was built on promises: fertile land, endless opportunity, new life. But when most emigrants arrived, they found hardship waiting instead. Land was harder to claim than guides promised. Farming demanded endless labor. Diseases still spread through frontier towns. Hunger still haunted families. The trail was not a road to paradise. It was a road to another kind of struggle. The dream of Oregon had been propaganda, a lure to pull settlers westward. And many realized, too late, that they had traded one hardship for another. The Oregon Trail is remembered in romantic terms: a grand adventure, a noble journey, a step toward manifest destiny. But the truth is darker. It was a road of graves, a road of disease, a road of broken bodies and shattered spirits. If you were dropped onto that trail today, no training, no preparation, no supplies, you would not last a single day. Not against the thirst, not against the hunger, not against the madness. Because the Oregon Trail wasn't about survival of the fittest. It was about survival of the luckiest. And luck on that road was rarer than gold. So the next time you hear someone speak of the Oregon Trail with nostalgia, remember this. It wasn't a story of brave pioneers. It was a story of desperation, of families walking into death with hope as their only weapon. And that's why you wouldn't survive. Not 2,000 miles, not 2 weeks, not even 24 hours on the Oregon Trail.